Good evening, everybody. My name is Danielle Jones-Resnick, and I constantly change my title. This week, I've declared myself the General Manager of National Council of Jewish Women Australia. Last week, I was something else, and next week, I'll probably be something different as well. Thank you for joining us here this evening for our important webinar to commemorate fleeing the horrors of war from a girl's perspective. We always like to cast a gender lens on all bits of history and history as it's happening. So I will be in control of the chat this evening. As you listen to our speakers, please feel free to put any questions you might have into the chat. You can either directly send them to me or to everyone, and then I'll direct them to our speakers as appropriate. We'll do our best to get everybody's questions answered so that we all gain the most from the session. I'd like you to all put your hands together and join me in welcoming Janet Merkur. Janet is one of the co-vice presidents of the National Council of Jewish Women Australia. She's a member of National Council of Jewish Women New South Wales, and she is the head, I believe, of the Kindertransport. She's the Australian chairperson for the Kindertransport Association. Please welcome Janet.
Thank you, Danielle. And before we start, I'd like to do the acknowledgement of country. Where I am presenting is on the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. We come together to have our meeting and to discuss various issues in a respectful and compassionate way to further our understanding. I also wish to acknowledge the elders past and present that may also be in attendance today. The importance of land, which encompasses so much of the Aboriginal way of life, is also embodied in everybody who has a homeland. And the loss of homeland affects everything from social to economical to mental health and our sense of belonging. So it's happened to the Ukrainian people whose land has literally been blasted from them by the Russians. And in the case of the Holocaust, our lands and identity were taken from us as well. Today, December the 1st, the World Kindertransport Day set up as an event to be celebrated in all its sections. So today and over the next coming few days, the sections in England, in London, in Germany, in Israel, 2 in Los Angeles, in Florida, in Canada, and in New York, where the president, Melissa Hacker, lives, to come together and remember the rescue of the 10,000 babies and children that remarkably were let out of Nazi-held Europe in agreement with the Nazis. So, sorry. If I could have the slide on the PowerPoint on now, I'm going to give a brief history of the Kindertransport, but then my focus is going to be on how it affected the young girls. So in this picture here, you can see that the children that were coming from Nazi-held Europe without their parents were very young. The average age was 7, But these little children are around 3 and 4. They have already arrived and kept together until their adoptive family or relative, could be an auntie or an uncle in England, came to pick them up. For the older children, including my mother, they were put in holding camps, or sometimes they worked on farms. My mother waited 9 months in Dovercourt until her foster family were able to pick her up. So next. So I'll be talking about the fear and the loss in young girls, what it was like to say goodbye, that final farewell, emerging into a new land, fitting into a new culture, and examples of the kinder as adults. The kinder put together a quilt. If you just go back to the picture before, sorry. And this is one example of one square that a kind or a child has submitted, which shows a parent, only one parent was allowed to farewell a child on the train. The train usually left about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, so as not to disturb the cities, and bound for England. And of course, it was a very tearful goodbye. For the little ones that we saw in the previous picture, in the previous PowerPoint, their parents would have told them they were going on holiday and that they would join them fairly soon. However, for older girls, like my mother, it was a realisation and a loss that why they were being sent away. So next slide. So the Kindertransport scheme was set up 3 weeks after Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was the burning of the books, the killing of 100 Jews, the looting of Jewish businesses and homes. In my family's case, their kitchenware shop in the 2nd District of Vienna was looted and daubed with paint, Juden raus raus, which means Jews get out, get out. There was such a hoo-ha in England that various groups, including the Quakers, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Christian Society, the German Jews for Germany, and politicians such as H-O-A-R-E, sorry, his first name's gone, petitioned and successfully were able to let children, as long as they were able to pay a bond of £50 and were not to be accompanied by their parents and were not to take out jewellery or any valuables. The little boy you see, number 26, left on the first train. The first train was on December the 1st, 1938. And on that was number 26, married to our cousin, Max Unger. And I'll talk about Max a little bit later. But the first train contained 200 boys, mainly from an orphanage in Frankfurt. And the document you see, the 7, mainly those women were nurses who accompanied children on the train. They then had to turn around once the children were exited on Liverpool Street Station, and they had to come back to Germany. In Munich, 2 little babies were thrown on the train with milk expressed and put into bottles, beautifully dressed and well taken care of. They miraculously got through. They didn't have any paperwork. The mother, however, research shows was murdered in Auschwitz, and the 2 little babies went on to live full lives in England. Every child that went on the Kindertransport scheme, 10,000 of them all survived the war. Had they not gotten on the train, they would not have. Next. So next slide. So this shows you the routes that the trains took. They exited from, places such as Vienna and Hamburg. The orange section is Holland. Once the train hit Holland, they were in free territory. The Quakers fed the children white bread and biscuits. The children didn't know what it was because most of the children had been brought up on rye bread, so they thought they were eating cake. Then there was a trip over the sea, landing in Harwich, and then eventually to Liverpool Street Station. Next. The children were told they were allowed to take one suitcase. In the case of my mother, she didn't have any toys or valuables. She took 2 sets of dishes because she came from a kosher home, a few clothes, and a paper bag full of schnitzels. However, most girls took a doll. The dolls having a very close association and meaning to the mother, to the family that they were leaving behind. Many kinder still spoke to their doll in their first language. The doll you see here belonged to Inga Jane Joseph Pollack, who was given the doll as a birthday present, and she kept it all her life. As did Lisa Jura, who spoke Czech to her doll. Expensive items such as violins and musical instruments were not allowed, but somehow Hilda Anker took an accordion with her and it was not confiscated. So she was lucky she was not sent back to Germany. So if you have a very close look at the picture of the girls just about to pull out of the station, the younger girl, very upset to leave her family, whereas the older one, looking perhaps pensively out of the window, realising she probably wants to go. She's been the subject of anti-Semitism in her hometown. Like my mother, she was kicked out of school because she was Jewish and very much wanted to go. The difference with the experience of girls and boys is that the girls, research shows, were devastated, not only for themselves, but for the parents that they left behind. Crying, sobbing, even screaming was very common amongst the girls on the train and even when they were in England. Whereas the boys were very excited. They thought they were going on a really big adventure, and many even thought they were going to play detectives when they got to England. Next. But for the girls, hanging onto the doll, quietly taking care of other children on the train, keeping up the morale of the others, was very common. I'd just like to read this poem. Me and My Emotions. It was written by a Kint, obviously long after she'd been boarded on the train. Will I ever grow up, really grow up? Will I be able to cut myself free from a bunch of letters? Letters that are old and faded as I will be before long. Are the letters the umbilical cord that tie me to my emotions? My emotions of being deprived. Deprived of what? Of being whole, a whole human being, a part of a whole family. For 52% of kinder, they never saw their parents again. And in fact, their foster family did become their second family. And if they lived in England, they lived with their foster family longer than they did with their first family. So this feeling of guilt and deprivation amongst the girls in particular did cause a lot of distress and later depression in women. Next. So these are original photos of the children just about to board the ferry, the one in the black and white. My mother boarded a ferry called the Prague. Now, I said to you before, the president in New York is Melissa Hacker. Her mother, Ruth Morley, also boarded the same train. The train from Vienna left on December the 11th. It was the largest shipment of children, 550. Whether they knew each other, we'll never know. But the president and I have that personal connection, and I'll get later onto Ruth Morley in a moment. So for 2 days, the Kinder travelled and arrived Liverpool station absolutely exhausted. But somehow evidence shows that the boys adjusted better to their new life in England than the girls did. Next. So I'm going to give examples of what the Kinder later did in life. And I'll use my mother as an example. There she is in the middle of the picture down below. She became Lance Sergeant Regina Morgenstern, RAF Enigma. She served in the Royal Air Force, took an oath by MI6, the Secret Service, being bilingual in English and in German. She unscrambled German Luftwaffe messages. There you see the large, on the right, the very high telegraph wires that picked up Luftwaffe messages typed in the Enigma machine. That's a fairly average-sized Enigma, so that probably would have been on a submarine or perhaps a boat. The ones on the aircraft were smaller. And the Enigma machine spat out 6 million computations, which had to be encrypted and then sent to Bletchley Park. So the hut you see down the bottom is hut 6 that I visited about 4 years ago. And it's all taped up at the windows. It's a marvellous place to visit if ever you're into Secret Service or even the beginnings of IT, because that's where it all began. And this hut 6 was the Air Force. They received the Air Force messages. So 1,000 Kinder served in the armed forces, both in England and in America. And the Enigma project shortened the war by 2 years and estimated to have saved 100,000 lives. Now, I'm not going to go into the Enigma too much. That would take me too long. But next slide. It just shows that some of the Kinder wanted to, really fight the Nazis and make some contribution to the war. So Bletchley Park is an hour and a half out of London. And very accessible. If you were signed up to come to Bletchley Park, you received a letter. Auntie Flo is unwell, and that is your secret code that you have to go to Bletchley Park. So next slide. I'm just aware of time here. However, other girls emerged into successful women. So Dustin Hoffman's Tootsie, that iconic red gown designed by Ruth Morley. Ruth Morley, a Kint from Vienna, was the fashion designer for Tootsie. Laurie Siegel became a famous author. She wrote over 30 books, still alive in England, as is Dr. Ruth. Now, Dr. Ruth left her homeland when she was 15, and it's one of the few trains that went to Switzerland. However, it's still considered part of the Kindertransport, and she's made an incredible life outside in America. So next slide. However, losing your mother and father at such a young age did have devastating effects. The Kindertransport was no way an easy option. We have a member of the family, I'll just call her Francesca, who was put on a train when she was 10 and ended up, you see this picture of these children down below, in an orphanage outside of France called Pringy, a Christian orphanage. Mistrustful, somewhat of a hermit, with major health issues. She could become very quick-tempered. A lot of kinder did sink into a life of living alone because they never heard from their parents again. And it was a devastating outcome for them. So next slide. So this is my last slide. The Kindertransport Association supports efforts all around the world to keep children out of war. The one I want to talk about is the picture down below that you see of people on the top of a train and little children sitting on the top of the train were about 4 or 5 years old and from Mexico. So these are illegal immigrants sitting on the top of the train trying to escape to America. Because a lot of the little children fell off the train to their deaths, the Kindertransport Association was instrumental in stopping this practice of putting children or anybody on top of a train. So Project Hope, Save the Children, 2020 to restore sight to blind children are some of the few organisations that the Kindertransport supports. However, in last week's Daily Telegraph, I read that a young woman by the name of Deborah Richardson has helped to knit, along with all her other, obviously not her by herself, volunteers, over 20,000 teddy bears for Ukrainian children stranded in orphanages and throughout Ukraine. So what began as a solo mission, Mrs. Richardson has turned into something that helps 47 villages throughout the Ukraine. So that is my presentation. Please, if there are any questions, put them in the chat and we can discuss them later. Any feelings that you have about how how a young girl would feel leaving their family. I'll try and answer what I can. So now I want to introduce you to Kateryna, who is going to speak about, perhaps I'll leave it to her to say what she's going to speak about, but we're very proud, very happy that she's here with us tonight. So welcome, Kateryna.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you so much for the background that you've provided, your personal story. I know we had a chat before this, and I learned a bit more about your family's experience, and it was absolutely heartbreaking, but to see the resilience that your family has come through all of this with, and for you to be able to raise awareness and share your personal story, it was very touching. So thank you very much for that, and also thank you very much for the invitation to join you tonight. I've also prepared a short presentation, but it says that host disabled participant screen sharing. So if I could have access to screen sharing, I'll be able to pop it up here.
You should be able to now. Sorry.
Okay, yep, got it. Perfect, share, thank you very much, Daniel. Okay, so can you see all that?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, so I'll go through the presentation relatively quickly. The topics that I'd like to cover is just the background, where I come from and why I'm here today, the current situation in Ukraine, and what I'd like to focus on is forced deportation of Ukrainian children, specifically young girls as well, and what can we do as this group here and as global citizens to help. So in terms of background, obviously map of Europe, as you can see, Ukraine, if you take into account a part of Russia, Ukraine is the physical center of Europe, the very western part of Ukraine. So Ukraine is the largest country in Europe by size. What currently is happening there and the atrocities that occur every day is very difficult to speak about because I personally have my entire family back there. I arrived in Australia 10 years ago. My husband's Australian, which is how I ended up here. Have a little girl that's 3 years old. I work in finance, and in my volunteering capacity, I'm also the co-chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations, which is the peak body for 22 community organizations here in Australia. I work very closely with the displaced people that have come here from Ukraine, which is how I'm able to provide a little bit of background here. So this is what Ukraine looked like before. This is what Ukraine looks like now. So the green areas on the map are areas of Ukraine that have been taken back by the Ukrainian armed forces. Everything that's in red is currently occupied by the Russian Federation. On February 24th of this year, most Ukrainians woke up to missile strikes and bombings of key Ukrainian cities, and that war is continuing now into its 10th month. So since February, the Russian armed forces have completely outnumbered and outgunned the Ukrainian armed forces, but it's unbelievable to see how such a small army up against such a massive army with so much more ammunition and just so much more power, how they've managed to not only regain territory, but actually hold them off. You would have seen in the news that there's been illegal referendums and annexation of territory. There's currently daily missile strikes of targeting key infrastructure. Most of Ukraine is in blackout. I speak to my relatives on a daily basis, the ones that I can get a hold of, because there is no electricity, there is no running water. Right now, most areas in Ukraine are sub-zero temperature. Ukraine's currently gone into winter. There's snow everywhere. It's very cold. You can only imagine normal people, they can when I say normal, people that are between kind of the ages of 20 and 50, let's say more mobile, they can get out, look for restaurants and cafes that have generators to use their public restrooms to be able to get a hot cup of tea. Everyone else that's a child or the elderly, they're literally stuck in their apartments. Most people live in apartments in large cities in Ukraine. And if they live in a high-rise apartment building, they can't even go up and down a lift because there's no electricity. So for example, my grandparents live on the 13th floor of a high-rise building. They're both in their 80s. They physically cannot leave their home. And they currently don't have water, electricity, or access to even heating. So very difficult conditions right now. Ukraine continues to fight for its freedom and its existence. We have many displaced people here that can share their personal stories. And later today, you'll hear from a very brave and courageous girl that actually managed to go through war and end up here. In terms of official stats, there are almost 8 million refugees outside of Ukraine that have fled mostly on foot across the border. Just a snapshot on Australia. So obviously we've seen what's happening in Ukraine. How has it impacted Australia? So over 9,500 temporary visas have been issued to Ukrainian citizens, and about 4,600 have arrived here. Why that's important and why it's topical for today's event is that 70% of those people that arrive are women with very young children, either children of preschool age or children of school age. So it's very difficult to imagine yourself becoming a single mother almost overnight and having to travel all the way to the other side of the world, or some Ukrainians say completely off the map, have to restart your life here with minimal English, usually no friends or family, and also the trauma that comes with coming from a war zone. So in terms of the Ukrainian situation, there was a humanitarian visa program that was available until the 31st of July. That program expired. So now Ukrainian refugees that are arriving here, they're coming on tourist visas. They have the opportunity to apply for protection visas, but those are in the queue for years. So they don't even know the outcome of what life awaits for them. As you can imagine, that anxiety and uncertainty also adds to the pressure of the trauma that they have coming out of a war zone. So what we've tried to do as a community is to provide a national accommodation database for people that arrive here. They can fill out a form on ukrainians.org.au, and if they don't have a place to live, we try to match them with a number of Australians. We have over 4,000 Australians that have registered either with a spare room or a spare apartment or a house that currently isn't occupied, to help with temporary accommodation for these displaced, mostly women and children. We also have donation centers all across Australia, and we as a community have launched fundraising campaigns. We've raised over 6.7 million in humanitarian aid that goes directly to Ukraine. And then we've also started a resettlement fund here that's primarily targeted at women here that are trying to rebuild their life. And we're almost reaching $500,000 mark there. These are some photos of the assistance that the community has provided. In the top left, you can see an employment workshop. Ukrainians are really keen to get onto their own 2 feet, find work, and be able to support their family while they're here. We also have different mental well-being classes, like the one on the right, where we had a yoga for mums and bubs session, and that's also to help with mental health, to help with finding a sense of community. On the bottom, we've had community picnics where people can come, talk to each other, share their experiences, and find the support that they need. In terms of what I would like to really raise awareness about today, and this deals primarily with children, is the forced deportation of children. And it's something that unfortunately we don't see much in the headlines. There's quite a bit of news about it in Ukrainian media, but there isn't at least I don't see much in Western media, and especially in Australia. So the numbers that I'd like to raise your awareness on is as of November 14th, and this is in the Russian media. They have published that more than 705,000 Ukrainian children were illegally deported to the Russian Federation. Ukrainian authorities have the names and whereabouts of about 12,000 of those children, but the rest are unaccounted for. So where the 705,000 number comes from, that's something that's reported in the Russian media. And the way that they report it is that they have saved these children and that they have rescued them and that it's a noble deed. But the way that it started is systematic targeting of orphanages where these children are quite vulnerable. They don't have adults that can speak for them. So that's the first kind of target. Then there have also been many Ukrainian families that have been in occupied territory. So as I previously mentioned, there have been these sham referenda that occurred in eastern and southern Ukraine. And so in these occupied territories, the Russian Federation has formed these so-called filtration camps, and they basically go through families and see who they will let out into Ukrainian territory, who they will keep in the occupied territory, and who they will send onto the Russian Federation. So there have been many cases of families being split and absolutely torn apart. Children aged 5 to 16 have been placed in foster families with Russian citizens. There's immense amount of psychological pressure that goes on in those filtration camps. When the children are torn away from their families, they're told that their families don't want them, that they don't need them, that they basically rejected them, and that they now belong in Russia and they should start a new life there. There have been, there is a state-owned web portal called Children of War, .gov.ua that the Ukrainian government has created, and that's where they provide the names and the stories of some of the children that they actually have information on. They're obviously it's a very difficult number to put a concrete number around, just because the information is so fluid and the situation is so fluid. But this is what I'd like to draw your attention to, is that you can go onto this website and see the scale of these forced deportations that are occurring. One story that I would like to also bring your attention to is this made quite a bit of news in Ukrainian media. This was a 4-year-old child. Her name's Alisa, and she was torn away from her mother when she went through a filtration camp. Initially, the news was just that there was a mother and the child was basically taken away from her. There was a massive social media campaign that was launched around that to reunite the family. And then so about 9 months later, the child was actually reunited. But what came out of that was the Russian armed forces found out that Alisa's mother was a medic, and she was providing medical first aid to members of the Ukrainian armed forces, and they deemed that as a risk factor, and they detained her mother in the filtration camp, as many prisoners of war were detained, until recently. She was part of the exchange that was negotiated between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. She was finally freed, and then she was reunited with her daughter. But just the sheer fact of having a little 4-year-old torn away from her mother and shipped off into a scary and unknown place. Me as a mother of a 3-year-old, I can't imagine the sheer trauma that would have caused for this little girl and her family. This is the website that I mentioned about Children of War. It's updated daily. You can see stats here of 440 children died, many more wounded. There are children that are missing and unaccounted for. There are also positive stories of how children were found and reunited with their families, but this number of 12,340, this is the number that I referred to before. It's quite low, considering that Russian media is advertising over 700,000. And this is not a live website, but if you click on the arrows, you can see the faces of these little children, and all of them have a family or personal circumstances that they were going through. So not only do they have to deal with constant bombings, fear for their life, just in a war situation, they now have to deal with psychological pressure, the trauma that comes with it, not to mention the critical infrastructure, the hospitals that are being targeted, where they, even if they were injured, they couldn't even get proper care because of the state that the hospitals are in. So what I would like to ask everyone on today's Zoom and anyone that you speak to is that there are definitely steps that can be taken to help with advocacy around this really concerning issue of forced deportation of children. So any international organization or any organization in general can raise awareness about these atrocities that are occurring by strongly condemning the crimes that are being committed. Just speaking out about it and raising awareness is a step in the right direction. Step two is that we can take all possible measures to establish the whereabouts of these Ukrainian children. So there are international organizations that are meant to be working in this. So for example, the Red Cross, Amnesty International, these massive organizations that actually have the power to step in and negotiate. They need constant reminding and pressure as well. So these kids are not forgotten, because they're also multinational organizations. They're dealing with a million things at once, but the well-being of these children is very important. Number three, we need to increase political pressure, whether it's here in Australia or whether it's abroad, on Russia to make sure that they immediately cease doing what they are doing. So they should not be able to take buses and trains and just massive amounts of children, put them into this transport and just ship them off. That should not be accepted. We should also call on all the UN bodies to assist any other international organizations in obtaining more information about the whereabouts of these children and how they can be protected. Because once these children enter the Russian Federation, there's really no way to track their whereabouts. They literally just disappear. So we don't know whether they're sent on to further orphanages, whether they're adopted by families, whether they undergo further psychological pressure. There's been cases of propaganda being used and just psychological warfare in that stand. So with a completely and very vulnerable group, there's more that we can do to help them and to protect them. And as I mentioned before, we should completely stop the transport and the transfer and deportation by force of Ukrainian children. And as the last slide, this is from a school in Eastern Ukraine. There's a girl that stands in what was her former classroom. You can see in the background, that's where the chalkboard was hanging up, completely destroyed from the shelling and the artillery that was being used. And I can say that a huge chunk of Eastern and Southern Ukraine currently looks like this. So these are unimaginable conditions to live in, never mind to survive in. So we as an international body group and having access to other organizations, I just ask you to please not forget about Ukraine, to speak up, to act and help in any way that you can, and any assistance would be greatly appreciated. That's it. And as Janet mentioned, I'm also happy to take any questions afterwards. And I'm not sure if now's the appropriate time, but I'd also like to introduce you to our next speaker. Is that right? So firstly, thank you for your attention. I know this is not easy to talk about. One thing that's not easy to talk about is, I know for our next speaker, her name is Dasha. She's 15 years old. I first heard Dasha speak at her school, at Winona School in Sydney. And I was honestly in awe and amazed how much such a young girl could go through and how strong and resilient she can come out of it. We also have her mother, Kateryna, on the call on Zoom today. And Both Kateryna and Dasha arrived here since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, and unfortunately had to see and go through things that I wish no one would ever have to go and see, live through and see. But they're now safe here in Australia. They have lots of support, lots of love around them, and I would just really love the opportunity for you to have to listen to Dasha's story and what she had to go through and her take on this as a young girl coming out of a war zone.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Dasha. I'm 15 years old, and me with my mom, we came to Australia from Ukraine, and today I'll share a little bit of my story. So let me share the screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Hopefully, yeah. Yeah, so one second. So I've lived in Ukraine my whole life, and even though life in any country would have its obstacles, I've always loved my country dearly, and fleeing it has definitely impacted me in many ways and shaped me into the person I am now. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's still hard to wake up every day with the realization that Ukraine is still suffering right now, and that the war has been going on for more than 9 months now. Every Ukrainian city has been crazily affected by the war every day. My major eastern cities such as Donetsk, Luhansk, Mariupol, you can see on the screen, Kharkiv, they are partially or completely destroyed, and they undergo heavy bombings every day. Russia has committed also has committed numerous war crimes in Ukraine. War crime is a violation of the laws of war. It includes the intentional killing of prisoners of war and civilians, torture, and the use of illegal weapons. Russia has intentionally killed war prisoners several. Sorry, did you see my presentation, or is it stuck?
Yes, now we can. Yes.
Yeah, do you see this now?
Now, yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'll show again. So this is the cities of Ukraine. This is Donetsk and Luhansk. This is Mariupol, and this is Kharkiv. So, okay. Russia has committed numerous war crimes in Ukraine. A war crime is a violation of the laws of war. It includes the intentional killing of prisoners of war and civilians, torture, and the use of illegal weapons. Russia has intentionally killed war prisoners several times. One of the most shocking examples being the Russian attack on a prisoner camp in Russian-occupied Donbass, killing more than 50 war prisoners. Russia also uses illegal weapons such as cluster bombs, flash sheets, and unguided missiles on residential areas. You can see there is the amount of people that Russian soldiers killed, and yeah, you can see that on the screen. Kyiv, the capital of the city where I lived, and other major Ukrainian cities have undergone several massive missile attacks in the last 6 weeks, which have heavily damaged the city's critical infrastructure. As a result, Ukrainian energy systems are on the brink of collapse now. Ukraine faces a humanitarian disaster as millions of Ukrainians potentially face life-threatening conditions without electricity, heat, or running water. In numbers, it's approximately 12 million people who are cut off from the grid. Many residents were left without power for 20 or even 30 hours. Back in the first days of the war, fleeing Ukraine was an essential step to survival. When I woke up on the 24th of February, I had to quickly hide away in a shelter. For the next 7 days, me and my mom were looking for ways to flee our city, as we lived in the small town very close to Kyiv, Irpin. Our first plan was to come to Kyiv and catch a train to any western city. We were planning our leave. The bridge that connected Irpin and Kyiv, this one, was destroyed with the aim to not let Russians enter the capital, and we were forced to abandon our plan. Our final plan was to evacuate using an electric train and then catch the train to another Ukrainian city. Even sticking to this plan wasn't easy or safe. We decided to catch the electric train after Irpin's mayor organized an evacuation. That day, hundreds of people gathered at the train station, including us. We were waiting for the start of the evacuation for 3 hours more than planned, while we heard the sounds of bombings everywhere around us. Later, we found out that the reason for the delay was a Russian fighter aircraft that fell somewhere near the train's track, and our people were inspecting it. Finally, after waiting for so long, we managed to get on the train and leave. A few hours after we did, Russian forces entered the city and occupied it. In a few weeks after Irpin was liberated, Ukrainians found petrifying evidence of Russian war crimes. Throughout the occupation, Russians tortured, raped, and shot civilians. Their victims were men and women, children, and the elderly. The occupiers stuffed some of the bodies into bags and buried them with an intention of hiding the committed genocide. Police found many corpses doused with flammable substances. Russians tried to burn them. Today marks the 280 days of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine is still suffering from the Russian invasion, and even though we always try to stay positive, it's easy to admit that Ukraine crucially needs continuous help from other countries right now. Lately, Ukraine and Ukrainian citizens have been needing extra help, as Ukraine is having enormous problems with electricity, water, and heat provision, which were brought to the country by numerous Russian missile attacks. I hope that our society can keep supporting Ukraine as much as possible, because it's essential not only for the win of my country, but also for peace of the whole world. Thank you so much for giving me the place to speak up, because I think it's very important for Ukrainians to speak up and share our experience. And yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dasha. I know it's not easy to speak about such things. For those listening here, I'm not sure if you're aware of the scale of atrocities that occurred in Irpin. Closer to the beginning of the war, you probably heard about places like Bucha, which there have been absolutely thousands of people just massacred in the streets. Well, the three cities that are the most famous are Bucha, Irpin, and Hostomel. And Dasha and her mother, Tatyana, are very lucky to be here from the city of Irpin, which were in world headlines for all the wrong reasons. So thank you very much, Dasha.
Thank you very much, Kateryna and Dasha. I mean, the talks that both of you gave have horrifying similarities to what happened to the Jews, how they, how the horror of ethnic cleansing or racial cleansing meant that, one awful regime felt it was their right to dominate another, to take property, to take children. And it's just an evil that is completely horrific part of the human race. So thank you both for giving us more of an insight. For Kateryna, 7.8 million refugees, that is a huge amount of people. And the stark images that Dasha provided really brings home the horrors of war, of destroying people's houses, people's homes, where you've lived, where your families have lived. I think I'll give people a few moments to gather their thoughts. I know there are some comments in the chat, which Danielle I'm going to hand over to, but I think perhaps people might want to raise their hands as well. But I'll hand it over to Danielle first. So we'll see what's come out of the chat.
Thank you so much, Janet. And I would like to thank Dasha and Kateryna so much. As Janet said, I have learned so much from you, and I'm sure the rest of our audience has learned so much from you, both the overall stark picture, but then the individual impact by Dasha telling part of her story. This is the opportunity for individuals to ask anything that they'd like to ask. So if you'd like to raise your hand, I will call on you. Or if you would prefer to put your question in the chat, put your question in the chat. You can send it privately to me, or you can send it to the whole group. But I'll just give you just 30 seconds just to sort of absorb what you've just heard, because all those messages were so powerful. And if we jump right in, we might fail to take in the true extent of these stories. But then if you want to start raising your hands, I will slowly call on you. Dahlia, would you like to start us off? Please unmute.
Hi, thank you so much for Kateryna and Janet. Of you know, sort of heart-wrenching talk about these horrific issues. And what I wanted to know, if there is any way, or in like with a Kindertransport, or even now with Ukraine, is there any way that you can organize a reunion? Was there any reunion with the Kindertransport? Any parents and children were ever sort of reunited after the war or whatever? And I'm also interested about Ukraine and how does one help to maybe make it happen, you know?
All right, well, I'll start off with the Kindertransport. As I said, the Kindertransport was not an easy adjustment. And although 52% of parents never came back, some did. So we know of instances where the parents survived concentration camp, came back to pick up their children, and their children didn't want to go with their parents because their memories of their parents, who they hadn't seen 5-6 years ago, was different to the reality of emaciated, older-looking people who had suffered concentration camp, and they didn't recognise their parents. And their foster families had really made them a part of their own family. So in some cases, the children did not end up with their parents, and the parents then decided to emigrate and make a new life in America. And some of them did. There is one instance that I know, I'm not going to say the lady's name, but she was hidden in Poland and brought up by an old lady, a pig farmer. And she was left when she was 2, and her parents came back and miraculously found her playing with the pigs, and she still had her original sweater on with her name on it. And the child screamed and screamed and screamed and did not want to go and leave who she thought was her mother now, the old lady. So eventually the parents convinced the old lady that the 3 of them would take care of the child. They would help the old lady, which they did. They moved her out of the farm. They bought her a home. And slowly the painful process began of parents being reunited with their child.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dahlia, and thank you very much, Janet. Our next question is for Kateryna. Kateryna, you had that list on your second last slide of things we could do, but as individuals, that feels a bit big picture. Are there campaigns that we can, like what am I thinking? Things that we can sign on to, or statements that we can release to show both as a collective body, but also individually, how that we are in support of the people of Ukraine, and especially in the attempt to stop this mass deportation of children.
Absolutely. I wouldn't underestimate. So the thing that we take for granted here, and I know I do as well, is the power of democracy and the power of individual voices. That's what Ukraine is fighting for tooth and nail right now. What I've noticed during, and I haven't been active in any sort of political work or advocacy before this, unfortunate circumstances have led me here. Over the past 9 months, I have honestly been truly shocked and surprised at how much an organization's voice, whether it's a statement or a letter written to a member of parliament, or a letter on behalf of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations written to an Australian minister, how much that has been taken into account, listened to, and we've seen some sort of action result from it. Not always what we want and the quantity that we want, but just the sheer fact that we are listened to as a community, as well as individuals. There have been hundreds of displaced people that have been reaching out to their MPs in the areas that they've settled, and these members of parliament have completely opened their doors, listened to personal stories and situations, and actually assisted people on an individual basis, and also added to the advocacy in Parliament. So if the National Council of Jewish Women or any other organization that anyone on this call belongs to, making a simple statement of saying we condemn this, and there is currently forced mass deportations of children, for example, not many people know about it. Just the sheer fact that you put out a statement about it, first of all, raises awareness. It shows, and if you happen to write to politicians as well, it shows that a certain cohort of the Australian community is also aware of it, care about it, and they would like to see some sort of action. So if one person says it, then an organization says it, then a member of parliament says it, it raises the profile, and things slowly start getting into action and the wheels start turning. So one thing that was told to me by someone that escaped from an occupied territory is that there are obviously news headlines, global headlines that reach the world over. But what happened in Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of small little towns in Ukraine that are completely being wiped out, nothing short of genocide. And people just don't know about it because they're either in occupied territories. Once Ukraine comes and recaptures land, everyone's very excited that Ukraine has made progress and Ukraine is making some sort of, winning the war or gaining its territory back. But with each one of those towns that is liberated, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of massacres that occur, and then all this genocide comes to the surface. But imagine how many, as I said, thousands and tens of thousands of little villages that don't have the international press there, that don't have people that can shine a light on it, where these atrocities and mass murders occur. And that's exactly what's happening with the children. These children are the most vulnerable members of our society. They don't have a voice. They don't have anyone to stand up for them. And in most cases, people don't even know that it's occurring. We see these general numbers, 700,000 children. Just imagine how many little souls and little hearts are being tortured by all of this, whether it's psychological or physical. So please don't underestimate the power of your own word and the power of making a statement as an organization, because collectively, all those steps that did sound big picture, that's how we add pressure to it, and that's how we get change and for larger organizations to stand up for these poor children.
Thank
Well,
you.
I'd like to say that the National Council of Jewish Women would like to join you in writing those protests. So I have your details. We'll be in touch, and we certainly want to join in on the campaign.
Absolutely. And we've had a request that I'll pass on to Kateryna now as well, before I address a question to Dasha, which is about, and I've already been in contact with Kateryna about getting the slides, which is about, are you happy for us to take some of those statistics off your slide and use them in our social media posts?
100%.
Yeah.
All that information was sent to me by our embassy, so the Embassy of Ukraine in Australia. If you need more information, I can certainly dig up more. And then I'll let Dasha speak for herself.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Dasha, thank you so much for being so brave and telling your story. I don't think most of us here could imagine at 15 having been through what you've been through and then coming to talk to a bunch of strange women online. Is there something that we as a community can do for you who, while we're fighting for those who are still in the Ukraine, what can we do for those who have made it to Ukraine so that you feel more secure within our Australian community?
I think it's just when you hear about different stories of different people, maybe you just try to show genuine understanding and toleration to them. As I think you can't feel at home or safe if you're not understand, if people don't understand you and maybe relate to you. So I think if any bits of information people tell you or you meet Ukrainians and you speak to them, maybe you, yeah, I think it's very important to show understanding and toleration to them, because we obviously trying to get through a lot. So I think it's one of the most important things you can do is while speaking to a person. It's just, yeah, show respect, understanding, and toleration.
Thank you. That's a beautiful message. And I know as Jews, we have the message of treat the stranger well because you too were strangers in the land of Egypt. And that's something we carry with us every day. Does anybody else have a question that they'd like to address to Janet, Dasha, or Kateryna? Feel free to unmute yourself. If nobody else has anything to ask, I will hand back to Janet to conclude the meeting. You're on mute, Janet.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here tonight, for our speakers, Dasha and Kateryna, for sharing such stark details, and our resolve at National Council will be to help you. I hope Dasha will continue with success in her studies and will find her place wherever it's going to be, whatever your life is going to be. We welcome you with open arms to Sydney, and we'd welcome both of you to our events too, so you can learn what our community is about. So with that, thank you everybody for coming tonight and commemorating the children that survived. God bless them all. Good night.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you all. The next NCJW event will be on the 20th of December, and it will be Hanukkah's Women Waging Peace, Not War. And we look forward to seeing all of you then and into the future. And if we don't see you beforehand, happy Hanukkah and happy New Year.
Thank you so much, everyone.